You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
You're listening to Mission Log the Orville, an episode-by-episode discussion of the adventures of the crew of the USS Orville.
Hello and welcome to Mission Log the Orville. I am Jessica Lynn Verdi. With me, as always, is my co-host,
Mike Richards, as always. Mission Log is a conversation, and this is a conversation with Brannon Braga that was really, really good. I was enjoying the heck out of it. Just it ran kind of long, so we made the decision to cut it into two parts. What you saw last week was the Trek years.
It's sliced in half perfectly, basically.
Yeah, and what are we going to talk about this week?
Well, thankfully, the Orville, which is what this podcast is about. So we get to learn a little bit more about Brannon's involvement in the Orville and, you know, our general questions and being fangirls about him.
Yeah, fangirl-ish, which...
Ish.
Yeah, and the website Fangirlish just named us one of the Star Trek podcasts to listen to, along with the other Mission Log family of podcasts. So
we'll take that win.
Good segue right there. And if you want to comment on anything on last week's podcast, this week's, or anything other ones, if you're getting caught up on the Orville for the first time, you can get us at ML_the Orville on Twitter, Mission Log Pod on Facebook, or Mission Log -the Orville at roddenberry.com.
Yeah. And if you're watching this on the Roddenberry YouTube channel, please just hit like and subscribe. Tell your friends. And, you know, you can also become part of our Discord just by signing up through Patreon for just a small $1. I think is as simple as that. I might be wrong about that amount. But anyway, this is time for part 2 with Brannon Braga.
Enjoy and thank you.
I'm gonna throttle us past because we're just gonna get to the Orville. We got to talk about the Orville.
Yeah, we do. So, and if you don't mind, I think I just kind of wanted to kind of throw this out there. So you've met Seth at this point. You've been working with Andre. You've got David A. Goodman kind of in your circle at this point. You've got guys like Marvin Rush, Joe Minoski, Mike and Denise Okuda.
Slouches.
And all of these guys want to come along for the ride. I do want to mention real quick before we get to the Orville, a couple of shows that you worked on that I thought were absolutely brilliant. Number 1, Threshold. Love that show. That show needed more seasons. And I watched the pilot episode of Flash Forward yesterday and really, really enjoyed it. That's available on abc.com, on the ABC app, if anybody wants to watch Flash Forward.
You were part of Flash Forward? I didn't know that.
With Seth MacFarlane.
Well,
go ahead.
He has a role. He plays an FBI agent in the show. Flash Forward. I wrote that pilot with David Goyer, and it's I think it's the best pilot I've done. And Threshold. You know, you look at Threshold with its cast, Peter Dinklage and Carla Gugino and Brent Spiner and more. You're like, wow, how did that cast come together? But it was just on the wrong network. Like CBS was not doing sci-fi. You know, it just wasn't. Certainly not at that time.
Has that, and I've seen season 1. It's hard to find now. I did at one point get the entire season from my library and watched it on DVD. Has that story been continued either in graphic novel or novel form? Can you find, because the next, so. Okay, because it went on to, I think the idea was Stranglehold and some other.
Yeah, we had a whole plan.
Yeah,
we had a whole plan for the show, but it just was not connecting with the CBS audience.
That's a shame because that was excellent.
It's a whole story. I mean, it's like. That's a whole other, you know, I developed this science fiction show for them. They had a script. I helped them turn it into a show, and then they decided they didn't like any of the science fiction elements. It's a long story. It's like, imagine doing a show about aliens where you're not allowed to use the word alien. That sums up my whole experience on that.
Wow.
That
sounds like a creative vice.
Yeah, creative tension.
Anyway.
Wow.
But we had Andre on the show, and I mentioned that show is right up there with Firefly as far as like one season gone too soon, brilliant but canceled. Should be more.
I agree.
Well, to be fair, too, we're not in a rush. You can talk to us as long as you want to, but just know we're on your dime.
That's okay. Let's keep going.
Let's do it. We're doing it.
Where did so now that you've worked with a bunch of these folks that kind of all became part of the Orville, what was the genesis of that idea? Was that something you and Seth talked about on Cosmos? Is that something that you went to him with, he came to you with, or did it come from somewhere else?
No, Seth and I talked about doing a Star Trek show together. And when that wasn't in the cards, he had some ideas. He always had the certain ideas for certain science fictional characters, like the Mocklans, the all male species, was an idea he had for a very long time. It hadn't been part of anything yet. It was just kind of an idea that sounded really cool. And the Orville came about when I got a phone call one day where he had written a script on spec, essentially, and it got picked up by Fox, and he said, "Do you want to work on this thing?" It was that simple.
Excellent. That was probably, the show premiered in 2017, so this was maybe 2015, 16?
2015, yeah.
Okay.
Yep, it was 2015. And so I hadn't written an episode of Star Trek in 10 years.
Wow.
So I wasn't even sure I knew how anymore.
What, how did it, and Seth had about, half a dozen episodes or so written, like sort of written before production even started. Is that a fair statement, or?
We had the pilot, and then we got a room together, a writer's room, and we wrote, we wrote all the episodes.
All the season 1 episodes?
Yeah. Yeah. And same with seasons 2 and 3. We had all the scripts written ahead of time because he's playing the captain. So the traditional thing would be that if the writing was going on during production, where would he be, Right. Yeah. All the scripts were written ahead of time.
How much of a challenge did you find it similar to like Voyager, where you're like, we got to go check out some new? What did you focus on? Did you guys focus on the aliens or the human stories? When was that decision made? I asked like 7 questions. It's like one of my skill sets is not making a lot of sense.
So it made sense to me.
I figured.
And he will answer every 7.
The initial focus on the show was, like any show, you had this pilot that set up specific characters and specific aliens, and it was taking the dynamics that were set in place and wrapping, stories around those things. We wanted to come up with cool, high concept, standalone science fiction tales, which was something just not on television in any form. That the art of that kind of storytelling went away. Right. Kind of with Star Trek, it was, most shows were continuing storylines at this point, and we wanted to make sure it had that Star Trek optimism about the future, that it was the ship was a comfortable place to be, kind of like the Picard's Enterprise, that it was a future you'd want to be in. Seth wanted the show first and foremost to be a good science fiction drama, and that the humor be kind of a comedy frosting.
Was the humor forced on you guys? Because I know there's a lot of speculation, or like a lot of people have opinions as, oh, well, he wanted it to be all drama, but then the studio made him do, or made you guys do the humor.
No. What happened was, and you can see it in the pilot. The pilot actually had Seth had I think a few more jokes in there, and there were some that Jon Favreau wanted to take out for various reasons. But I think we were all kind of like in this place where the humor was more present at first until we got comfortable with the drama. Like it was definitely more of a comfort zone for Seth, and it was more present as an element initially. But I think what ended up happening with the network was they wanted to promote it as a funny show. They wanted to promote it as Galaxy Quest, or Family Guy in Space, satire. Seth really, and they did. So one of the things that Seth did was we had actually made an episode for later in the season, like episode 9 or 10 or something. And it was called About a Girl, and it was a Mocklin episode where the Mocklins have a baby girl that gets a sex change. And Seth, it's very dramatic and kind of devastating and controversial. And Seth said, we need to make this episode 3. We need to pull this up in the order because this is the show that I want to make.
That episode was so powerful and had one of the few, it had almost, if you're familiar with City on the Edge of Forever, the Edith Keeler story, where Kirk has to let her die to save the future. And the famous last line of the episode is, let's get the hell out of here. That's it. The show had that very same feel to it. Like they lost what they were trying to do. They were trying to save this baby's freedom of choice, and they failed at that. And the episode just kind of had that ending. And that was, I'd have to look it up, but I'm pretty sure that episode was directed by a guy named Brannon Braga. And when you were directing this episode, did you know, or was the plan from the beginning that Topa would take on this such a tremendous part of the arc or of the story from season 1 to 2 to 3 and possibly beyond, or was it just kind of a one-off when it was?
It was never a one-off because they were going to have this kid. And we knew we were going to do something with Topa. That Topa was probably going to realize who she really was. But her role in the geopolitical maneuverings of things and the symbolic role that she would take on and all that, and the Dolly Parton of it all, that manifested later. I mean, years later, when we were conceiving episode 3. So, but we knew something would come of it. But the reason Seth wanted to move that early was he wanted to make a stronger declaration early on about what the show was. It's like, this is the show I want. I want the show to be this episode. And it was much more, it had funny bits in it. But in essence, it was a very serious family courtroom drama, kind of thing. And with a powerful ending. And we had to find out sooner than later, is the audience going to accept that vision for the show? Are they going to reject it? There were some scathing, I've never seen, I don't think the reviews of this show were so brutal. There was one guy who a science fiction, covers science fiction for various websites, and I've known for years, and I'll never forget him saying to me, we had a big set visit for all the journalists and stuff, and we had given the first 3 episodes to various reviewers, including About a Girl. And I remember him coming up to me saying, it just really doesn't work, does it?
Whoa.
And I'm like, oh, I think it does. And he's just like, yeah, it's just kind of doesn't know what it is. And I'm like, oh boy. And then the review, I'll never forget when the reviews started coming out, Seth and I were like, oh, these are bad. And then the show aired, and if you were watching social media, it was a completely different reality. The fans knew exactly what it was. The fans knew what Seth was going after because Seth himself is one of them. I mean, he's a fan, and this is the show he wanted. This is a show he would want to watch.
Yeah.
He famously does, I think, listen to the fans. One of the things that we've asked, we've had David Goodman, Tom Costantino, Andre, and Seth on the show already. And I always kind of ask, like, what the mechanism is for improvement, for continuous improvement. Because I think the show really, can, whether it's subjectively or objectively, it does improve.
Well, look at your Star Trek shows. Look at Next Gen. Look at Voyager. We just talked about.
Yeah,
they got better as they went.
And what do you attribute that to? Just experience or fan feedback, or is there some kind of data collection and analysis tool that you have that would be really cool to have?
We definitely don't want fans to think that they have too much control over something artistically either.
It is a relationship that is,
right,
I think, unique in the world of science fiction, fantasy, and especially with the advent of the internet. You can't help but relate to the fans. You have to. I mean, you would be crazy to not. You have to kind of know who's just being a jerk to be a jerk, and what's good feedback. But I mean, to me, one of the coolest things that happened in the 90s with Next Generation was when Mark Altman started writing these capsule reviews of Next Gen episodes every season in Cinefantastique. That was new. That was something that was very new. So, of course, we were very interested in seeing his ratings for the shows.
Right.
Did my episodes get 5 stars? And so you look at this stuff. Now, you got to take it with a grain of salt because the reviewers hate it. Most of the people who reviewed the show really didn't like it very much.
I mean, the gall to come up to you and say it doesn't know what it is, like, that's unbelievable to me. I mean, not unbelievable, but that person obviously thinks very highly of their opinion.
I think maybe he was just comfortable. We'd known each other for a long time.
Oh, well, then that's fair, too. It's still...
But it was also... I was a little taken aback. But but there's a kernel of truth to it, in that Seth always knew exactly what the show was going to be. But he wasn't entirely 100% comfortable taking out too much humor because of the expectation that there would be his trademark humor. But then at the same time, like any show, you just don't know exactly what's going to pop and what isn't. You may think a certain character is going to be the big thing, and they, like the Mocklins, my favorite part of, I love the Mocklins so much. I could just watch a whole show about that marriage. To me, that's one of the things that immediately was evident was going to be a much bigger part of the show than we anticipated, because you had these two classically trained, serious, dramatic actors playing these roles, and they were hilarious. But also you were you're so invested in their marriage that, to me, my favorite scene of the first 3 seasons is in season 3 when Clyden comes home after Topa was kidnapped and tortured, and he comes home.
Right.
but not a dry eye in the house.
No.
Think about it. You're looking at these idiotic alien makeup.
Sex obsessed male culture.
It's like it's also absurd. It's also ridiculous. But you're crying.
And the acting is amazing. I mean, Peter breaking into the council chambers when he called the Mocklins butchers and liars. The scene of him going after the Inquisitor. The scene between Adrian and Chad, where they were fighting it out towards the end of season 3. Just so many amazing acting moments. And, as far as the humor goes, funny things happen at work, right? I work in what some would consider a fairly serious business. We laugh a lot because funny things happen at work. And that's, I think, the kind of balance.
So that's another thing that surprised me. So the shakedown of the show, figure out what was working, what wasn't. Obviously, the Isaac Claire relationship, which was not necessarily intended to be such a big part of the show, did become a big part of the show. That's just stuff like that. Now, there were things that really surprised me. One of my private concerns was because of the humor and somewhat, I was worried that the audience might not connect to the show as much because of the humor was just too much and took you out of it. But the fact then, what I realized was people were like, no, this is just more like real life. Just like you were saying, these are just characters that like they really would be if, and I'm like, oh, I completely misread that situation. This actually is making things more real for the audience and relatable for the audience.
And we did talk about that on our early episodes, is that while the cast or the characters in Next Gen were very aspirational, right? Like I would love to be like Jean-Luc Picard or William T. Riker or one of those folks. The cast of the characters on the Orville are much more relatable because there are times where you can see their insecurities and you can see them maybe getting a little bit of that pettiness starts to seep in, or that those kind of emotions that we all deal with and try to push away as best we can. They're much more relatable to me. And I think the humor makes it relatable to me, at least.
I think you're right. Yep. One of the major changes in season 3 was the move to streaming, because Seth was having to cut out material, and it was driving him nuts. Good stuff, good, funny material, dramatic material to make these network running times. And
is there any possibility of seeing that in a director's cut DVD Blu-ray
That's exactly
box
my
edition?
thought too.
Oh, there's some great stuff. I think there was some great like there was an arc where the Boris and Clyde start smoking cigarettes. That I think there were a couple of great scenes that had to be dropped from that arc.
Oh my God! But what speaking of relatable, we're like, man.
But so that move to streaming in season 3 was profound, because all of a sudden we could tell stories that were 90 minutes long. We could really dig in and tell stories with epic scope, emotionally and action wise. And it's a huge thing. Enough can't be said about it. I didn't really fully understand why he was so adamant about moving it to streaming. But then I very quickly realized when we were writing season 3, this is going to be this could be amazing.
I mean, I think the result is clear, right? Like being able to luxuriate in moments and linger on even Isaac, who you can't see his face, but in episode 1 you see him looking out longingly outside. I mean, yeah, he's doing a lot of acting with his shoulders, but it works, and it worked.
It does. Brandon, I want to pass along a compliment that you got, and I honestly forget the source. It might have come from Tom Costantino. It may have come from Larry Nemechek. I forget. It may have come from somebody totally else. But what he said about you particularly was that you were always willing to listen to feedback, whether that came internally or whether that came externally from fans. But you're always willing to listen to that feedback and consider it and use that to make what you were making better, as opposed to folks who are maybe making another version of, sci-fi at the current moment, where there are 5 series in production that kind of tend to more or less defend their position and don't maybe listen as well. So you were given a shout out among a conversation that Jess and I were involved in, and it's just escaping me right now, that you were very willing to kind of listen with the goal of improving, and no ego, no just being vulnerable and taking that feedback for.
Well, it's a collaboration. Making the show is a collaboration with so many people: the editors, the writers, the directors, the actors, and all the other people who put so much into this show. But it's also a collaboration with the audience on a show like this, where the fans are more vocal for whatever reason. I don't know what the internet fan base looks like for Yellowstone or Grey's Anatomy. Perhaps it's the same. I doubt it.
Jessica's very plugged into Grey's Anatomy. So.
Well, I'm not someone that engages actively with the community. I was one of those people who didn't know that liking Star Trek was cool until I was out of school, because I was made fun of for that stuff. But Grey's Anatomy was like my guilty pleasure thing. So yeah, you see people go, I can't, when one of the main characters was killed off because who knows what, it was gutting. And you might want to go on the internet and share about that.
It's
just connection, I think, at the end of the day, right? I was looking at a video of one singular brain cell that was sending electric firings to literally form a connection, and I felt like that was a grander metaphor for how much we crave it. There's times when I talk to my therapist and I'm like, why do I care what my brother thinks or my dad thinks? But we need other people to grab our hands and go, I see you, I feel you, or even if I don't understand you, I'm here for you. And so much so that our brain cells even want that. That's just
that's interesting. And when I've said this before, but you walk into a Star Trek convention and suddenly you're in a space with thousands of people who all have a shared history. It's a fictional history.
God, that's such a perfect way to look at it.
But you could stop any one person and you could have a deep conversation about that history. And that's a connection.
Wow.
And there's that fictional history, but then there's the very real history. There's the history of me sitting in my living room, with my older brother, watching the original series on reruns, and him explaining to me how phasers work and how the transporter works and things like that. But then there's me watching Kirk, McCoy, and Spock put their heads together and make the best decision they could, even when it was a difficult decision, even when they were doing the right thing was the hard thing to do. And that's kind of the real history, and that kind of shaped who I am and how I make decisions to this day. So there's that combination. I think every Star Trek fan you talk to, they're going to say, I had this happen in my life. Things were really bad. And I had this to get me through that. And that's Next Gen for some people. It's original series for others. It's Enterprise for other folks. And speaking of fans, a lot of fans of the Orville are very critical of Kurtzman era Star Trek. Why do you think that is? And what do you think the Orville has maybe that the other shows are missing?
I haven't seen enough of the other shows to say. I will say that kind of thing was being said about the Star Trek I was working on. It was the same thing. There's always going to be a contingent of people who say this isn't real Star Trek, or prefer. There's a generation who preferred Kirk era Star Trek. At some point, the modern era Star Trek overwhelmed the Kirk era Star Trek in terms of sheer number of episodes. But there was, on Next Generation, I'm telling you, man, there was no internet, but people would write letters. There were plenty of people who criticized the show for its storytelling and its, not being as good. And so I think the Kurtzman era, I think the one thing that you do need to keep an eye on, and I'm not saying the Kurtzman isn't doing this, but there has to be, with Next Gen and Voyager and Deep Space Nine and everything surrounding those shows, you felt like you were watching the one universe, and things we were we manicured what we were doing and made sure that it had a hermetically sealed integrity, that it was, we were, and that sounds like a small thing, but you really felt it was one thing. There are a lot of Star Treks out there. I don't know if they're paying attention to each other, but I hope they are, because that, I know I read an interview with James Gunn about the DC universe, and I really related to what he was saying. I'm like, yeah, he inherited a franchise where no one was paying attention to anything, and everything was all over the place. Whereas Marvel has this, I think Marvel has to have, the guy running it has to have been a Star Trek fan, because he's doing what Star Trek did in a cohesive, like in a universe with a history that's building on its history. Marvel is doing a brilliant job at that.
And I think the Kurtzman era Trek is doing that to a very strong extent. I want to point out the difference between an episode of Strange New Worlds and an episode of the Orville New Horizons. And the episode were similar in that they could maybe be loosely described as kind of haunted house episodes. The Strange New Worlds episode was called All Those Who Wander. And the episode of the Orville was called Shadow Realms, you might be familiar with. And there was a crashed starship in All Those Who Wander, and it was infested with the Gorn. And the solution to dealing with this savage, scary, killing, intelligent, sentient race was to kill them all, wipe them out, kill every single one of them. The solution in Shadow Realms, when there was an opportunity to kill all of the aliens in that story, was to give them the chance to leave in peace before killing them all. I think that is a stark contrast between the approach that those two shows took, and I think one of them is much more in line with the Star Trek philosophy than the other one is.
It's interesting. That's an interesting observation, and I think probably a correct one. I'll take it a step further. One of the things that is also speaks to what you're saying is, if you look at the episode Domino from season 3, which has, arguably one of the biggest space battles of all in TV history, what's at stake it's not Earth. Our it's not our species. It's an idea that's at stake. And the idea is we don't commit genocide.
Even when it's your enemy.
Even when it's your enemy. Like, we're not protecting Earth in that story. We're protecting the Kaylon. And that's what we've brought every ship in the fleet to protect. And that, to me, is what makes... I just really like that about the show. Anybody can make Earth at stake, or anybody can make, it's like it just loses impact after a while. It's not interesting.
I think that speaks to the constitution of all of you. Like, every time we've gotten to talk to everyone who's been involved with the show, I just walk away with like a renewed sense of like, God, these people are great, or at least trying to do the best they can to make Earth today its best, represent us at our best, and reflect us at our best too. And I do think that starts in your own heart, wanting to tell those stories.
There's an inclination. There was talk at times when I was at Star Trek about making Starfleet evil or corrupt. And there were certainly attempts at that. I was a part of it. It wasn't I wouldn't go there. I wouldn't go there. It just seemed cheap to me. Yeah, sure, of course you can, but maybe you could come up with something else. Like, isn't that what the aliens are? The species are for. It's like the one. What is it getting you? Exactly, in doing that, it's like
an easy story.
Humans there are still aspects of humanity that are horrific. There's an episode of Voyager called Equinox. It was a 2-part episode where we encounter a ship like Janeway's that's lost in the Delta Quadrant, and it's a captain. Is it Ransom, I think, and he went down the dark path. And Janeway goes down the dark path in that 2-party, and she ends up torturing a man. And to me, that was like a special occasion like that, and it was built into the Voyager premise. How far was he willing to go to keep his crew together and alive? So there were times that we would explore certain things.
When
like
pushed to the brink, right? What are you capable of doing?
But Janeway, and she pulled herself back from the brink.
Right.
Because, and even Ransom himself was tormented by what he was doing.
And isn't that a more interesting story, too, to watch the forgiveness of yourself and others after having made such a bold mistake or error, like judgment mistake? I'd rather watch that story.
I think you put it well, in that we really are trying. I don't want to say, it's funny. It's just like when we talk a lot about the show as optimistic. I think you put it better, which is to say we're trying to put forth the best aspects of humanity, trying to make the best decisions in the most difficult situations.
Mike is so good at pointing that out. Like, every episode you get that morality break where there is no
but it's not
right answer.
And I'll tell you, there's a big difference between that and moralizing. Like, the show fails if it feels like it's wagging its finger at you. It can't feel that way. It has to.
They ask a question that anyone can answer.
And the characters are going to do the morally appropriate thing, but the audience has to be along for the ride. It can't feel like, and I'm sure there are plenty of Star Trek episodes that felt moralizing.
Sure.
But those are not the successful ones,
if I'm going to invest my time, and Jessica and I did a panel at Star Trek Las Vegas on the Orville, where we were joined by John Billingsley and Robert Picardo and David Livingston, who, although he has not directed an episode of the Orville yet, would love to, by the way, if you
he was my favorite Star Trek director. I was just, when I saw him the other day, I'm like, I got to bring him aboard somehow.
He, so in that panel, we talked about things that the fans love about the show. And personally, this is what I got. Jessica, you may have gotten something different. But if we're going to invest the time to watch the show, probably multiple times as a fan, and kind of pick it apart and talk about it with your friends, what's the return on investment? And the return on investment for me is model for me a process where I can make better decisions, where I can incorporate more information than what I had before. I can get different point of views. I can get both sides of the story, and I can make the best decision that I can possibly make. And that, to me, is why and how the Orville is worth that return on investment for me as a fan, and to do this show. And you're right. It's not wagging your finger. It's not getting preachy. I love the fact that about halfway through each episode, a couple of the main players sit down and talk about both sides. And then they just kind of see each side from the other's perspective. And there's nothing more, there's nothing more Star Trek than that process.
Yeah, I agree.
So in
answer to your question about the modern Star Trek, I don't know what they're doing. But
I think that's a good way to keep. Listen, I think you're right though that you're always going to have. And
everybody's seen it except us.
But let them have it. You know what I mean? I think as opposed to going, this isn't Star Trek. I think that's my biggest platform. It's just shut up and let those people enjoy it.
In all fairness, I think the goal is, and I think it's very successful. I think they're doing it very successfully, is to have something for everybody. Discovery does representation better than any show on TV. People can see themselves in those characters that have not been able to see themselves in characters in a production ever. Picard does a really good job of not only catering to next gen fans, but also working in current events into that. My two favorite series are Prodigy and Lower Decks, the animated series, and we'll see where Strange New Worlds goes. I think they're trying to recapture some of the magic of episodic TOS style storytelling. We'll see if the show grows a beard or not. A lot of people love it. I'm glad for those that do.
One thing they've got, and Strange New Worlds hopefully is doing this. They've got to stop cannibalizing the Star Trek canon.
Amen.
And tell stories that are about new worlds and new things, and because that's the main thing. It's and perhaps Discovery, because it was another prequel. I kind of had to deal with that kind of stuff, but I would encourage them to seek out new life and new civilizations.
Yeah, I think it's right there in the title. Strange New Worlds is what we're wanting to see. Hey, when we get to see a season 4 of the Orville, what do you just can't wait to? What are some stories that you just can't wait to tell? Just give us the whole plot right here with the hook and everything.
There are some obvious things that have been left unresolved in the show. I don't, you can use your imagination, but there's some Ed stuff that's left unresolved. I definitely would love to see. I don't want to say too much because, yeah.
Well, the fact that you don't want to say too much, I'm going to take as a hopeful sign.
I'm hopeful, but it's one of those things where just the fans just need to get on social media and continue beating the drum, and so that we can do a season 4, because it's not off the table at all.
Good.
It hasn't been ordered, but it's
it's not been canceled.
It's not been canceled. I think that season 3 was a very successful season, and certainly you could look at it as a fitting finale. The final 2 episodes, ends with a bang and a wedding. But I can say, we have more Orville stories to tell, for sure, and we would like to see it come back.
Hey, this is where I want to end the podcast on a way where Mike can take a double entendre.
A bang, a wedding, and then another bang.
Whether you meant to or not.
Anyway, we'll see.
Well, clearly we've had a very easy and enjoyable time chatting with you. I know our audience and the Star Trek audience at large will love to hear. I mean, there's obviously more we could pick your brain about too, so I might have to just have you come back.
Well, it's feelings mutual. I feel like we could talk for hours. So have me back on.
Everyone, he was willing. You were willing.
He was willing. Yeah.
Please.
Like, I was afraid to ask you.
Oh man, come on.
This was an easy.
You want to? Let's give it. Would you take a second? Take all the time you want to plug what you're working on now, or what you.
Oh,
what you got out there
right now. The latest thing is that the people I think might enjoy is The End Is Nigh, a show Seth and I created for Bill Nye about the end of the world and how science can save us. And it's kind of a disaster movie in the first half where Bill is killed in some fun way, and then he comes back to life to show how science can make disasters not happen or make them survivable.
I didn't know he was killed in the first half. I feel like there's got to be more advertising on that.
It's fun. So he kind of dusts himself off and then talks about it's on Peacock, I believe.
It's on Peacock. It was not. It's not. Didn't receive a lot of marketing, as streaming shows sometimes don't. But it's on Peacock right now, in America. It's on National Geographic in Canada, and it's cool. It's It's actually a lot of fun, and it has some good science in it.
And what advice do you have for? I've got a son who's a English major at UCLA and a daughter who's an English major at DePaul. So, what advice do you have for aspiring young writers?
I mean, they're in great universities studying English. I'm not sure what better advice I can give them at the moment. If they want to be screenwriters, they need to make sure they're living in Los Angeles, and start looking for things like internships. They have, they already obviously have good connections, people who know people. They just need, but the first thing I always tell people is you got to be here. You actually have to be here.
Yeah, makes sense.
Good advice. And where can people find you online if they want to
hound you?
Oh, the only thing I really look at these days is Instagram. It's just at Brannon Braga on Instagram. I'm on Twitter, but I don't follow it that much.
I think that's better. You're in a better headspace.
It's a friendlier environment for the most part, and I like the visual component. But yeah, I'm on Instagram, and if anybody, I'm fairly lonely, so feel free.
All right, yeah, I would love to.
We'll help you correct that. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. This was as enjoyable for us as I think as it was for you.
I had a great time.
And thank you so much. This has been so much fun. We may split this up among 2 episodes. Would love to have you back. But if we're ready to bring it home, Jess?
I haven't done this in months.
I was just looking for the nod. I was going to do it, but you did
go for it.
Mission Log the Orville is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. Technical production by the amazing Earl Green. Check out our other podcasts at podcasts.roddenberry.com.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.